Hey. Excuse me. So, for the last 7 weeks, we've been doing this series called, called Unsinkable. And that was to go through the last 8 or so chapters of Acts. But we've actually been going through the book of Acts in the Bible for more than a year with a couple of breaks. And so even though we went through this Unsinkable Faith series and we talked about all the things in the last 8 chapters of Acts that makes faith in Jesus unsinkable, in another sense, today I really want to sum up the entire more than year-long series in the entire book of Acts. So I'm going to preach through the whole book again. I'm just kidding. And so I want to end with this, and I want to end with this because I think this is the theme of everything. Is that when you finish the book of Acts, I think that the thing that should occur to us is just simply this: that we are now left to run the race. That is, we, the church, those who believe in Jesus, we're Acts 29. In case you're wondering why that's pithy, there's 28 chapters in Acts. Okay, and we're Acts chapter 29. One of the things that's interesting about the book of Acts is Radhika read those last couple of verses, and it kind of ends with sort of this strange ending. Commentators for centuries have been kind of puzzled over why exactly Luke leaves it right there. A lot of people naturally think that because Luke ends there and people hear that Paul was beheaded after his imprisonment in Rome, they believe that after Acts 28, Paul was beheaded, and so it kind of ended, and why end gruesomely? But that's actually not true. This imprisonment is called Paul's first imprisonment. He is exonerated and released, lives 5 more years, goes on a number of more missionary adventures, and is only then killed in Rome after the end of his second imprisonment, not after a trial, but because Nero needs to kill a bunch of Christians to convince the Romans that he didn't set Rome on fire. And so you kind of wonder, and it's not because Luke died, because in 2 Timothy, right at the very end of Paul's life, in his second imprisonment, just before he died, he says the only person who's with him is Luke, which means Luke was there. Luke was with Paul, so he could have written all about his other adventures, right? So there's a number of commentators that have said that there was going to be a third book of Luke, that Luke was going to write a trilogy, that there was, Luke about the life of Jesus, Acts about the ministry of Peter and Paul, and then there was going to be another book about the last 5 years of Paul's journeys. Paul explicitly says in Romans he wanted to go to Spain. He says in Romans 15, he says, I don't really want to preach in places where Jesus has been heard about. I want to go to the places where Jesus hasn't been heard about. And I think it's the Muratorian Canon, a very ancient Christian document that says that he went to Spain and did a whole missionary journey through especially eastern Spain. And once you get to the other side of the Iberian Peninsula, Britain's only 21 miles. And by the time you get to that period in Rome, England is well known. It's called the islands in Roman literature. And all through Isaiah, it says that the word of the Messiah is going to reach the islands. And Clement, the second bishop of Rome, is from British ancestry, who is, according to church tradition, the son of Claudia, who was one of the hosts of the church at Rome. So it's very possible, we know Paul and her were very close, and it's not at all unlikely that Paul, in fact, there's a number of traditions that Paul went to Britain. In fact, St. Peter's in London is supposed to be on the hill where Paul preached for 3 months to a number of Celtic tribes and British peoples. But none of that is in Luke's third book because we don't have Luke's third book. I would really love to read Luke's third book, wouldn't you? Who knows where Paul traipsed to in 5 years, right? He could have gone to England and Japan in that amount of time. Who knows, right? But the point is that once you get to a certain point, it's just a little arbitrary where to stop, right? You could say, well, Acts is about Peter and Paul, so you could have written it through the executions of Nero, and he could have just added another chapter about Peter getting crucified and Paul getting beheaded, and that would have been a really cheery ending. right? But the book of Acts isn't really about Peter and Paul. Right? Luke's gospel and Acts make very clear that these were not good people, Peter and Paul. Peter was clueless and Paul was evil. Right? I mean, that's where we find these characters. And yet, Jesus changes them. The Holy Spirit empowers them. Jesus creates his church and sends it into the world, and he sends the message of the gospel of Christ's death and resurrection and how it can redeem and save all people and all things out through them into the entire world, first in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and then to the ends of the known world. That's what the book of Acts is about. That does not end with the death of Peter and the death of Paul. In fact, it hasn't ended. When you understand the message of Acts this way, that it is the work of Christ transforming people through the gospel, empowering them with the Spirit, creating the living church, and sending the church and its message out into all places in the world to save people and redeem things, there's literally no difference between the last verses of Acts and this present moment in your life. I already went through this stuff, sorry. I'm not a very good slide clicker. So just for example, just this week, right? In the 4th century is St. Patrick, which is not the patron saint of getting drunk, honestly, right? I mean, St. Patrick was a really rebellious youth. He was born grandson of a pastor. His dad was a deacon in Rome, and he was a really rebellious 16-year-old, rejected God, and got himself kidnapped by pirates. And the pirates sold him into slavery in Ireland, and he kept sheep and those like really scraggly looking cows for a number of years, about 6 years into his early 20s. And it was in that lonely wilderness of his slavery that he came to Jesus. And he said to survive the cold and the rain and sitting out on those hills, he prayed sometimes 100 times a day and 100 times a night. Until one day in his early 20s, he saw a vision. God came to him in a dream and told him about a boat that would take him away from his slavery if he would go find it 200 miles away. And so he ran away and he traveled 200 miles. And he found this boat where it was supposed to be. And there were a bunch of traders there from the Roman world, and they didn't have any food. They'd like run out of money and run out of food. And so he prayed, and this group of like half feral hogs came running towards them, which then they saw as a sign of God, and because God made bacon, and they took these pigs and they made it back to Rome, and he went to seminary and he became a priest, and he was in the center of the church in the known world, and then God came to him again and he said, I want you to go back to those crazy people who enslaved you in Ireland. And Ireland at the time was known as literally the armpit of the world. It was the most backward, illiterate, fornicating, insane, just demon-possessed place on planet Earth. I mean, the Romans were afraid to fight these people because they would have orgies, run into battle naked, painted, stone drunk, trying to act like they were possessed by demons. So that Roman warriors who'd fought all over the world were pretty terrified half the time. And that's where he went, and he knew that they were crazy. So what he did was he took all of the land his family owned, he was from a wealthy merchant family, and he sold all of it. And he took this big pile of money to Ireland, and he paid tribal leaders not to kill him and to let him preach the gospel in their tribal area. He literally bribed himself a hearing because this is what the culture was like there. And then people got converted, and then he built these not ornate, very un-Roman churches that were deeply Celtic and deeply Christian. And he took everything he could in the beauty, because these were human beings. There was still beauty to their culture. He took everything he could of the art and the beauty of this incredibly wicked culture and brought the gospel to it and produced this thing called Celtic Christianity, which eventually produced a monastic order that a number of historians say ultimately saved civilization. The most uncivilized people at this moment in Roman history after the effect of the gospel and the creation of Celtic Christianity became the history pod that carried Western civilization through some of the worst ages of Byzantium. One guy living, recognizing that he's Acts 29. He is the movement of God in his age. He is the one who needs to live entirely for Jesus, and he has no idea what's going to happen. Yet by the end of his life, there were more than 1,000 pastors trained in Ireland, and hundreds of churches, and thousands of Christians. And we can go all the way through from the death of the first apostles through all the great early church leaders and the great theologians, and also all kinds of other people who wrote philosophy. But it's not just these people. There's all kinds of things that we might call normal people. So, for example, I don't know if you know this, but do you know how we got Guinness beer? Staying on the drinking theme with St. Patrick. There was a Christian family, I believe a Scottish Christian family, and they were incredibly troubled by how malnourished kids were on the aisles at the time. And they're just entirely just broken about how kids were just dying of malnutrition, losing their sight, and they were tiny and all these kinds of things. And you couldn't trust the water, modern filtration hadn't happened. And so they decided to come up with a drink that would be sterile enough that it wouldn't produce dysentery, yet would be mineral and nutrient rich enough that it would help these kids that were dealing with incredible malnutrition, and they created this thing called Guinness beer. That is where Guinness beer came from. The broken heart of Christians, a Christian family that wanted to deal with the malnutrition of children. In fact, Os Guinness, the famous American Christian philosopher who's from Britain, is actually a descendant in that family. And there's thousands of these things. Christians inventing the first hospitals. It was normal Christians. It wasn't philosophers that stayed in the towns in the first two great bubonic plagues and nursed their pagan neighbors to health, which is how Christianity won the first cities. It wasn't because there were these really awesome preachers. It was because Christians didn't leave their neighbors to die and lost some of their lives and the lives of their children in not fleeing the plague because of their love of neighbor. And because their bishop said, if we're going to love our neighbor unto death, well, here's our chance. And it comes right up until the present day to things very simple like sponsoring a child or welcoming an Easter guest and inviting them out to lunch and spending some of your money to make them feel welcome and to see where they are in relationship to Jesus and how open they are to the gospel and being open to actually being a friend to them instead of just moderately friendly. Being the church spreads through all this time and all these ages. You are Acts 29. These people in Acts, they are dead. Paul is not coming back to bring the gospel to Madison. It's very unlikely, right? It's possible Elijah or Enoch could be sent back down. That's also unlikely, right? We're Acts 29. We're the Linuses and Claudiuses and Peters and Timothys and Silases and Eunices and Tabithas, and it's you. There's a passage that I think clarifies what this is supposed to look like for us, and Hebrews 12, 1 through 7, I think is very clarifying, and partly because it starts with this idea that the people that have gone before us are gone from the race, but they're not gone, right? It says, therefore, and in chapter 11, this is chapter 12, right? It's coming after chapter 11 in Hebrews, and chapter 11 is all about all of the people of faith going all the way back to Abraham forward, up until the most recent martyrs at that moment, and how all of them were full of faith and trusted God and lived the gospel. And he says, now that I've gone through all these people, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. You see what he's saying? He's saying in every generation we should be motivated not just by Jesus, but by every generation of Acts 29 that's come before us. Well, every generation from Acts 28 all the way back to Luke chapter 1, and then all the way back to Genesis 12. That we should recognize that all of the people that have been part of this story all the way through are a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. And they can't run, all they can do is cheer, and we can't even hear them. But they're there. And we are the ones running. And therefore, there's a certain kind of way we have to run this race. We have to believe that we are Acts 29. We are the church. We carry this gospel. We are the ends of the earth and are going to the ends of the earth. Well, there's 4 things in these 7 verses that Radhika read that tell us what does it mean to run that race, to be Acts 29. The first is to throw off everything that hinders, right? Remember that verse? Throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. One of the reasons why a running metaphor is decently good here is because if you look at runners, what are you not going to find? Right, backpacks, wallets, keys. There's nothing. Like people who run marathons, they don't carry anything they don't have to carry. That's one of the things about running. Like you run, like I've tried to run with my phone in my pocket. I can't even run with my phone in my pocket. Most runners, if they run with keys, they don't take their keys. They'll take the key off the chain so they just have the key to put in a little pocket so it doesn't bother the heck out of them when they're running. Because extra keys is too much to carry when you're running. Why? Because if you really run, it really is a hindrance. Marathon runners don't even carry water. People have it for them along the way. They have shoes, socks, strangely short running shorts. Like they don't even want this much extra fabric to push up against with their quad, right? They have to show the tan line no matter how high it is, right? Because if you're going to run, after a little ways, you feel every bit of extra weight, every tiny hindrance, everything that's kind of pulling at you, you feel it. You know it's holding you back. You know it's costing you energy. You know that you shouldn't have it, right? And in Greek times, you had to run literally naked. Like that's how people ran in the old races. It's one of the reasons why Paul refers to uncircumcising somebody, undoing circumcision in one of the Corinthian correspondence, because there were some Jews that wanted to compete publicly, and you couldn't if you were a mutilated Jew, and so they would actually surgically try to get their circumcision undone because you had to run naked if you wanted to compete, and that was one of the rules. Now that's not a lot of extra weight, right? And so one of the things that people often think about is how intense do I get about deciding what I'm going to do, what I'm not going to do, what's going to be part of my life and what isn't going to be part of my life. And there's actually not as many commands. Like when you look at the New Testament, you look at like what commands from the Old Testament are brought forward, and if you read everything in the New Testament that's anything like an indicative, like do this, how many commands are actually in the Bible that we're supposed to be living according to today? And the largest number that you can come to is about 1,050, which kind of sounds like a lot, until you realize that there's like 52 billion things in real life. Right? Giving positive commands is the surest way to leave everything else open. Right? The worst possible thing God could have done is tell us 5 things we were allowed to do. That's not what he did. He told us certain things we weren't supposed to do and certain things we were supposed to be. And then he kind of left it open. He said, love your neighbor. Now, when you recognize that, what we realize is that there's a ton of things in life that would fall under the category of permissible. It's kind of hard to make a really strong argument that the thing is intrinsically good, beautiful, and true and making everything better. It's also not directly creating major problems. It just is, and there's reasons that we want to do it other than it's the good, true, and the beautiful. It's enjoyable. It tastes good. Sometimes we need it, like sleep. So what are the principles by which we take these literally thousands and thousands of things in human life and decide whether or not they're going to be part of our lives or not? And there's basically two categories in the New Testament. One is in 1 Corinthians 9, or 6 and 10, where Paul says, listen, you say everything is beneficial for me, or everything is permissible for me, because the gospel leaves a ton of things open. And he says, but wait, is it beneficial? Is it beneficial, right? So that's the one question to ask. But another question to ask, and this is the one that the writer of Hebrews brings up, is this. Is it a hindrance? Is there something you're meant to do or something you're meant to be that this thing hinders you in some way from doing or being? So, for example, watching TV is within the realm of the permissible, right? So do you watch it? How much do you watch it? When do you watch it? I dare say that you shouldn't watch it as much as you want to. So how much, when, what, how, right? And one of the questions is the content of the thing beneficial? But you could waste your life watching the old reruns of wholesome shows. Like, there's a lot of retired people literally watching 7 hours of TV a day, and they think because they're watching Bonanza, it's okay. And it's not. Because even though what you're watching may be beneficial in terms of its morals and general storytelling, it is a hindrance to what you're still alive to do. And one of the questions we all have to ask ourselves is not just, is the thing allowed? Is it beneficial? When it comes to pursuing Jesus, running the race before a cloud of witnesses and being Acts 29 together with all other believing people, is it a hindrance of any kind? Would a runner carry this? And I dare say that thought would discipline our lives a good bit. It's haunted me in the best possible way for most of my Christian discipleship. The second thing is to throw off the sins that entangle. So everything that hinders, those things could be good things or indifferent things. But he also gets really specific to throw off the sin that so easily entangles us. And this is really critical because you're trying to run a race after Jesus, and you are comfortable with stuff that the Bible explicitly tells you is fundamentally against God. It's a little bit like getting all ready to go running, and having your shoes tied together. Entanglement makes it impossible to get any progress. And part of the issue here is that most of us, when we think of what's holding us back, even as Christians, we actually look against God and act as though it's his commands or his statements about how we should live and be or what we should believe that are holding us back. We look at the fences of what God lays down and we think that that's actually what's restricting us, when all the time we're tying our own shoelaces together. God's fences are very broad. And they stand between, like if you think on the other side of that fence that God has laid down in some commandment is some beautiful meadow in which for you to frolic, what you don't understand is there's a fence there because there's mines and sinkholes all through that thing. It's not because the grass really is greener over there and God doesn't want you to frolic in the green grass. But sin, though we look at it as though it would be a kind of freedom, is a baited hook. And it'll entangle us and tie us up in ways. And notice the word that so easily entangles us. One of the things that the gospel is constantly telling us is not just that we're rebellious against what God tells us, but that we are suckers and idiots for sin. And if you don't believe that in a pretty deep way, you're just naturally going to have a self-righteous attitude towards what God says and towards whether or not sin is bad. You'll take a whole bunch of things that God explicitly says is profoundly evil, and you will place it in the permissible category, and you'll say, what's the big deal? And you will do it on the basis of saying, well, if it's permissible, I can do it, and never even get to the point of saying, is it beneficial or is it a hindrance? And you'll wonder why you're all tied up in knots in relationship to your faith, and why it doesn't produce peace. Sin entangles. It's like tying your shoelaces together and then trying to run a marathon. Making peace with it isn't just wicked, and it isn't just self-righteous. It's silly and foolish. It's as ridiculous as somebody lining up for the Boston Marathon and tying their shoelaces together and then saying that they're going to be competitive or even finish the race. They're not. And we have the unbelievable self-deceiving capacity to tell ourselves that runners are supposed to tie their shoelaces together. That somehow it's more effective. It like tightens your shoes as you run. And it doesn't. And it's important to notice just the metaphor of he doesn't say, don't do this. He says, take this stuff and throw it off of you, right? Picture somebody really afraid of spiders, noticing a spider is on their shoulder. Right? Do you want me to do that again? It's like they're like, you know, you cannot get this off you fast enough. Right? Because when I mentioned TV, probably a bunch of you were like, yeah, I watch a little too much of that. You weren't like, that's not how you felt. But here's the thing that's so important to realize. So many things in life, the level of determination you have to feel to get rid of them has to be acute. It has to be so powerful. You have to be like, I am never going to do that. The first question I ask younger men when they tell me they have a pornography problem, you know what my first question is? It's not, how long have you been doing this? Or do you feel addicted? It's not, no, it's this. This is the first question I ask them. How far are you willing to go to be free of this? It's the first question I ask them. How far are you willing to go to be free of this? Are you willing to take your computer? Are you willing to take every device that you own with a screen and throw it in Lake Mendota if that's what it takes? I don't care if you write code for a living. Are you willing to do that? And if they say no, I say, I can't help you. In Romans, it talks about when we're full of the Spirit, we put to death the misdeeds of the body. Picture, that's execution language. That's strangle it to death with your own hands. Okay? Some of you know this and some of you don't. I've been a fisherman and a hunter most of my life, and so I've killed a lot of living things. And you can be poetic about it. It always drives me nuts when I watch hunting videos and people kill something and they're like, yeah. I'm like, you need to get a life. Because death is it's never pretty. And yet, it is the cost of eating stuff. And you'd better determine whether or not you're willing to do it. It's one of the reasons why people like guns, because it's a lot easier to kill stuff. When you get up close and personal, you need a lot different kind of like resolution to do things. I don't know if you've ever put an animal out of its misery. It's a horrible thing. But you've got to believe that it is a moral good to do it, and you're going to see it finished. And you need to understand that it was with very specific intention that the Apostle Paul used this language. If you are not willing to clamp your hands around the throat of the permissible thing that is a hindrance or the sin that is entangling you. To choke it to death, squirming between your fingers. If you aren't ready to throw it off, then don't kid yourself. And what you require isn't more effort. What you require is more faith. You require more faith in the beauty and the goodness of the God for whom you would throw it off to run with. But you shouldn't be confused about what it's going to take, which is why the very next verse clarifies this. And it says, in order to throw off sin and to throw off our hindrances, you are going to have to fix your eyes on Jesus. You are going to have to look at him, and you are going to have to see the beauty and the joy and the value and the truthfulness and the glory of Christ. And if you don't, you will never do that, and you are never going to run this race, and you will not be part of Acts 29 unfolded in all of creation for all of eternity. Now, track is basically my least favorite sport ever. I hate it with a vengeance, and I never ran cross country. But I did track for a couple seasons in my junior high years because, there's girls on the girl track team. And I ran distance, which thankfully in 7th grade is only a mile. And it's distance. But I learned a number of things about it because we trained running several miles and each day. And here's what I realized about especially distance running. Your emotion is your biggest limitation. Because your internal emotions will say, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, long before your body physically, literally can't do it. Long before that. And so what every runner, in order for them to be successful, has to do is to learn how to say to their emotions, shut up, shut up, shut up. I don't listen to you, I don't listen to you, I don't listen to you. I'm running. That is that their mind and their will put their emotions in their place. You can't shut up your emotions, and you really in some ways shouldn't try, because a lot of times your emotion is telling you stuff you're supposed to hear or bringing something into the heart you're meant to enjoy. But there are a lot of times, your emotions are often a very undisciplined little baby. And if you don't have the capacity to put them where they go, you will be the most untethered human being you can imagine, a trial to everybody who knows you, and a great danger to yourself. And so part of what you have to do with a runner is you have to get them to the place where when that voice is like, hey, we don't have to do this. Second place is fine. And the team doesn't need another point. Why kill yourself to make third? And that you're like, you literally, when you hear that voice inside, you do the opposite. Right? The second is you never look away from the race. You don't look at the stands. You don't look at who's cheering for you. You don't listen to anyone. You stay focused on what's happening on the track and the person you were chasing. That's it. If you talk to a really good runner, they'll come down at the end of a race and people will be like cheering really, really loud, and they'll end. And a lot of times they will say, when they're interviewed afterwards, they'll say, did you hear how the crowd was behind you? And they'll be like, what do you mean? Like they literally, it wasn't there. Because they were so exhausted that the only thing they could hold on to with their concentration was keep running, right? They just heard Dory over and over, just keep running, right? Like that was it. That's all they had, and everything else was blocked out, and they were only focused on the track, and they were only trying to make it to the end. That's all that was left. And then the third thing is that the best way to make somebody a better runner faster is to pace them with somebody better than them. Because it just naturally makes that second person just run a little faster. There was a place called Beaver River near us. They were this tiny school with about 300 students. I was from a school of like 1,500, and they were the state cross-country champions every year for the entire state of New York, every year. And the way they did it was this, is they always ran 5 together in every race, every time, even if they didn't win, until like the last 300 yards of a cross-country race. And the reason for that was that they would make everybody a really good runner. And then at the very end, they'd let their stars crank it out at the end. But they would have sped up everybody else all the way along the way. And everybody was constantly running and making the other person better. And nothing makes a runner better than pacing to someone a little bit better than them. They'll copy their stride. They'll feel motivated to catch them. They'll want to finish closer to them. And you see, all of those are clarified when you really fix your eyes on Jesus in running the race. I'll talk about the first one in a second, but if you're fixed on Jesus, you will not be fixed on anything else. Even other good runners. And you will always be trying to pace with him, and there'll be less confusion about how little you can do, and much more about, can you close this gap that still exists between you and him? That's what your mind will be occupied with. If you're running behind somebody you want to catch, you're not thinking, oh, I could run a lot slower than this and be fine. You're thinking, wait, there's 100 yards between us. I bet I could make it 70. And the reason why this affects our emotions is because it doesn't just say, fix your eyes on Jesus, who is the author or the pioneer, progenitor of our faith. But it also says to do so in relationship specifically to his greatest trial and his greatest triumph in the cross. So it says, let's fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and then now how? Or what is true about this person that we're going to fix our eyes on? Who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. Meaning, because of what he wanted to accomplish, because of the pleasure he took in that accomplishment, which was much greater than trying to win some race. It was the redemption of all of humanity. Because of the joy he took in being the one who would accomplish that redemption of humanity, he could look at the greatest trial of a human being, and he could shame its shame, finish the race, and be crowned the victor. We can only throw off what hinders us and the sin that entangles us if we have the kind of joy that pushes out the fear of losing things. The reason we hold on to our sins is fear and pride. Make no mistake about it. You're afraid that your life will be less awesome if you give up the thing that you're holding on to. And it won't be if you follow and chase after Jesus and receive from him that which he replaces all sin with, which is not a self-righteous, stuffy righteousness, but a deep, peaceful, joy-filled godliness that is a blessing and joy to you and everyone around you. And it's only with that joy that we can do the fourth thing the passage says, which is endure all hardship as discipline. Oftentimes when people read the first few verses of Hebrews 12, they do not add this in with. They see this as a different passage, but it's not really a different passage. It's part of the race metaphor. And so it says this. It says, in your struggle against sin. Now remember, it said right before that Jesus had endured scorn from sinners. And then it says here, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Now, I realize that for some of you, being polite when people are mean to you, if you were godly in that way, it feels like blood would shoot out of your eyes and you would shed blood. But that's actually not what happens and not what this is referring to. What he's saying is that in your struggle against sin, that is the external pressure from sinners who are persecuting you because of your faith and because of your character. In that struggle, it says already in Hebrews, you've been imprisoned, you've been fired, you've been marginalized, your belongings have been taken from you. A lot of stuff has happened, but listen, you haven't bled yet. That's what he's saying. In your struggle against sin, outside of you, and trying to live godly in the real world, in that struggle, you've lost a lot. You haven't yet struggled to the point of losing your blood like the people in the chapter just before this. And you've forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons or daughters of God. In that incredibly encouraging statement that calls you a son or a daughter of God, that can encourage you with joy to face all kinds of things you have to endure, is this: my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. And the reason it's encouraging is because the Lord disciplines those he loves and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. That is a quote from Proverbs chapter 3. And then he summarizes it with this sentence. Therefore, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as sons or as children. Now, that is very easy to misunderstand. Because the word discipline is parallel both in this passage and in the Proverbs passage with the word rebuke. And if you go to the Proverbs passage, it says something very similar. It says what this says. And so it's very easy to read that and say, when we say the word discipline, like we say, I disciplined my kids, right? But when we say that, we actually say it in the reductive sense. What we mean is, I had to punish my kid for doing something. But discipline actually is anything that is done by somebody in charge to make the person under their charge more prepared for what they have to accomplish. So if you're a coach, you might make your kids run wind sprints because you just want them to be in better shape because they're going to compete. Or you might make them run wind sprints because they played really poorly and didn't try very hard in the last game, and you're going to make them pay for it. Because if you're not going to hustle in the game, you're going to hustle at practice or you're off the team, right? I don't know where that coaching went. That's not how we coach now. But that was the coaching I experienced, okay? It was very shaping for me. And so discipline isn't just punishment. It includes punishment because punishment is designed to make us stronger. It's meant to make us repent and embrace what's good, true, and beautiful, and to live towards it, and to realize we were wrong and wicked, and to change. But everything else that makes us stronger is also discipline. So when he says this, he says, friends, listen, endure everything that is hard like it's discipline. He could have said punishment. He didn't. Because discipline covers everything that makes us stronger, not just punishment. And so when hardship comes, we're supposed to endure it all as discipline, not because it is punishment. He doesn't even tell you what the hardship is. So think of hardship A in your life right now, or that's coming, or that you just came out of, right? This verse does not say that that's punishment. That's not what it says. It doesn't even say that God created it in order to discipline you. It doesn't say anything about what God is doing. What it says is you should receive it as discipline. Because you have no idea ontologically what it is in God's mind. You don't know the metaphysics of getting fired. What you know is that it is a hardship. It is something you have to respond to it in a particular way. And what this scripture is saying is receive it as discipline. That is, combine it with faith in the goodness of God, knowing that God treats us as sons and daughters if we trust in Jesus, and he will utilize it to make us stronger, to make us more what we're meant to be, to renew more deeply the image of God in us, to make us into the true humanity as exemplified in Jesus, to make us the people made in the image of God we were meant to be. And it may include us becoming less the image of the human life we want for ourselves. In fact, it usually does. But it doesn't change the divinely created, Christ-redeemed, Holy Spirit-empowered, eternal being that God is making us into and that we were meant to be. And if you believe that Jesus died to make you that thing, not the version of you that's healthy, wealthy, and wise the way you want to be, you can realize that this verse can be taken holistically, literally, and must be. Now, I know that some people would look at that and say, okay, whoa, Nick. I mean, literally all hardships. I mean, are you saying that women being sold into sex trafficking and people being enslaved and literally? And my answer is yes. And I don't say that glibly. Listen, this passage was written to people who had literally lost their homes, been thrown in prison, thrown out of work, didn't know how they were going to buy food the next 5 months. This was not written glibly to a bunch of rich Romanites or something. This was written to people who had themselves lost most of their earthly possessions. And he said to them, not like, man, you guys are so awesome. He said, listen, you've forgotten God's encouragement that in all the sufferings and hardships of your life, you can embrace them as discipline because he's making you into something, because he is a father who treats his children as sons, and all good fathers allow their sons or inflict on their sons all kinds of discipline that we later, if we are wise, respect them for. That is, recognize that it was a fundamentally loving action. And so literally everything from you got sold into sex trafficking to my phone isn't working right now, which is an enormous breadth, quantitatively and qualitatively, of hardship. Literally everyone can be received as discipline. Believing that in God's providence, when the thing is received in faith, can lead us to certain things. And listen, you might say, listen, there is no way that in something as dehumanizing as slavery or sex trafficking or economic bondages or the kinds of injustices and oppression we see in the world, there's no way it makes any sense for you to talk like that. And it does, for two reasons. One is, there's nothing in this verse that says that you shouldn't seek to get out of it through righteous means. There's nothing in this verse that says that. And so people who are enslaved, or people they should seek to get out of it. It's good if they're rescued. We should try to stop it. This has nothing to do with any of that. The fact is, we are all morally lazy, and we allow lots of people to be oppressed for a very, very, very long time, and they should have some good word from God, other than we might get around to helping them someday. And part of that word is that they're a son and daughter, in God's use of that to make them the kind of creature they're meant to be. The second reason is this. When you become a student of the history of the world, especially the writings and experiences of some of the people who were subjected to some of the absolute worst and most dehumanizing horrors, there are many among them that find their deepest connection to true humanity in the midst of experiencing those things. So, for example, two of the greatest writers on the real nature of humanity in the last century, one of them was Viktor Frankl, who wasn't even a Christian. He was a Jewish psychotherapist who was sent to a concentration camp. His wife was sent to another one. She died. And he came up with a whole mechanism of doing psychotherapy on the basis of meaning rather than on the basis of how you've already been wrecked, i.e. Freudianism, out of finding true human meaning in a place where literally every ounce of human meaning had been stripped from him. And it took over psychology for a generation in terms of helping people find meaning in their problems rather than blaming somebody else for giving them their problems. He didn't get saved. That has nothing to do with the gospel. But one of the greatest 20th century insights about what human beings really are, our true need for meaning, and without even reading the Bible or hearing about Christ, came out of this man languishing away in the midst and seeing the inhumanity of concentration camps. Namely, Auschwitz is one of them. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is another example. He's a writer and an artist thrown in a gulag in the middle of Siberia. And it was in the midst of the absolute dehumanization of the Siberian work camps that he recognized what was the rot in the system of communism, how art outlasted humanity, what was wrong with the human heart such that both capitalism and socialism could create some of the worst injustices among human beings, and so on and so forth. And Corrie ten Boom is another example of this. One of the most profound testimonies of Christian faith of the 20th century is a woman who watched her sister starve to death and die in a concentration camp, and to lead others to Christ in the midst of that moment. Maximilian Kolbe is remembered by thousands, if not millions, in Europe, because in a concentration camp, when a man was brought forward to be killed, and he said, my wife and my children, this single priest said, I have no wife and children. I trust in Christ for my eternity. Let me die in this man's place. You will not see these things in the contemporary press, because the press says what's cool now rather than what is historically meaningful. That's why we come to church and do things like this and read. But it is a fundamental human fact that whether you're sold into sex trafficking or whether for 37 years your marriage sucks, And I mean that literally sucks the life out of you. You can receive all hardships as discipline. And it fundamentally changes every human experience. Because your other option is being angry. If we're going to be this generation's Acts 29, if we're going to run the race, if we're going to have an unsinkable faith, if we're going to live before a great cloud of witnesses, then we have to recognize that we have to be strong enough to shame the shame that is put upon us when we haven't yet resisted sinners to the point of shedding our blood. We have to throw off everything that hinders us, whether it's sin or whether it's things that are permissible but aren't beneficial and that are a hindrance. And we have to do it by finding the joy that comes from focusing on Jesus. I don't really have time to talk about this right now. This is like a whole nother really important point about shame. But you and I have to recognize that if we don't realize that this is how we become the Acts 29 church, nobody's going to tell stories about us. And listen, we're all going to ultimately reside in unmarked and unvisited graves. The cloud of witnesses of living people out there are not going to talk about you. And most of them are going to demonize you if you achieve anything. But there is a different group of people that talk about what really happened. There is actually a great cloud of witnesses, people who have witnessed the grace of God in real time, who have believed in and trusted him throughout their lives. There are people who have experienced the glory of Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit working in real time in their actual lives. There are people who have been the church throughout all generations and who are now glorified with Christ in heaven and who have some access, apparently, to see something of how we are carrying on the giving of the gospel to all people and the living of the gospel before all people. The believing in the cross and the resurrection of Jesus and the receiving the empowerment of the Spirit and acting out in faith and faithfulness. Those people are talking and those people are cheering. And they're watching Jesus running out in front of our little pod. And we are the ones deciding whether or not we're going to throw off all hindrances, focus on the runner in front of us, and do it out of joy, shaming the shame anybody puts on us, and taking from their scorn that we should have never sought their approval in the first place, and running for the cheering of all the people who are really cheering for the one we're chasing. And you and I can be that. We can be that in this city, at this time, in this generation. We are meant to be that. We must be that. We are called to be that. And through the power of the gospel and the presence of the Spirit, we are able to be it. You can live a life of ordinary greatness that you have not yet dreamed of. If you'll fix your eyes on Jesus, if you'll run the race, and if you will embrace that you and I, we are Acts 29. Let's pray together. Father, please help us to embrace who we're supposed to be and who we're meant to be. Please help us to know you as we ought. Please help us to want to throw off what hinders and entangles us. Help us to be willing to put it to death in the words of Romans. Help us to do that out of the motivation that comes from a joy in seeing Jesus, who cared nothing of the shame of the cross, who finished his race and who received the victory and sat down at the right hand of God. And help us to face literally every hardship as discipline, and to receive that truth as the most encouraging thing we possibly could, because when we receive things as discipline, we receive things because you have called us your son and daughter, and you use everything, even the most dehumanizing thing, in Christ and the Spirit to create in us true humanity. please help us to be those people and to be that church, and to show us how possible it is when we chase you, throw off our hindrances, and accept your empowerment.